Hello to Root Source and to all of my friends and students on this Root Source platform. This is David Haivri, and I am responding to a comment that I got from Rivkah on my class, Israel and the Nation, Zionism 101. And Rivkah writes, "Thanks, David, for explaining Shomron. We only know it as West Bank. I have a few questions. One, I have learned in my study of Tanakh that Jericho, Shechem, and Hebron were very important places for Israel. How come they are in Palestinian hands? I can understand Shechem and Jericho, the partition of 1948 by the UN, but why was Hebron given away in the 90s, if I'm correct? Two, was the tomb of Joseph not recently destroyed? Three, if most of the tombs are in so-called Palestinian areas, is that not proof enough that for the world to recognize the land belongs to Jews and Israelis?" Okay, Rivkah, I'm going to try to deal one-on-one with each of your questions. There are three questions here. And again, the number one, you said that you learned in the Tanakh that Jericho, Shechem, and Hebron are very important places for Israel. How come they're in Palestinian hands? Well, Rivkah, it's very sad that these important places are in Palestinian hands. I think that it's a great mistake of the government of Israel, who agreed to give over these areas to establish the Palestinian Authority and place these important historical and biblical cities in the hands of the Palestinian Authority. I think that was a great mistake. Why has that happened? Why did it happen? Well, the Israeli government signed the Oslo Agreement over 20 years ago. They recognized the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, a band of terrorists, and they allowed them to come into Judea and Samaria, or what you've heard before, what you know as possibly the West Bank. And the government of Israel allowed them to establish the Palestinian Authority, which is a local government within those areas, and they control those cities, Jericho, Shechem, and Hebron. And unfortunately, Jewish people are not allowed to visit those places or visit the holy places within those cities, and it's all very sad. Why has the government of Israel decided to do that? Well, they decided to do that due to international pressures. I think it was a big mistake. It's hard for me to justify giving over those cities to the Palestinian Authority. I think that was a mistake. The Palestinian Authority should not control those cities, in my opinion. Shechem, Hebron, and Jericho should all be under Israeli control. Now she says, you say, Rivkah, that I can understand Shechem and Jericho, and she writes the partition of 1948. Actually, the partition was in 1947 by the UN. The partition was a suggestion by the United Nations before the establishment of the State of Israel, when the land of Israel was under the British mandate, was under the control of the British, and there were Jewish settlers throughout the land of Israel, and there were Arabs throughout the land of Israel, and there was some conflict and pressures. The British had originally, in the Balfour Declaration, had committed to establishing a Jewish homeland in the Palestine Mandate, which was the area that today, on today's map, includes Israel and Jordan. Later in 1922, they established the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So they already cut off 2/3 of the land and gave it to the Arabs. And then in the UN partition plan in 1947, they suggested to cut up the rest of the western side of the land of Israel and to establish one state for Arabs and one state for Jews. The Arabs did not accept the partition plan, and they went to war against Israel when Israel declared independence, and they tried driving the Jews into the sea, and they did not succeed in doing that. In any case, at that point, when the Arabs refused to accept the 1947 partition plan, that whole idea should be stored away in history and not be considered a relevant plan to have any relevance for today. Rivkah goes on and she asks, but what about Hebron? Hebron was under Israeli control since 1967. Actually, the truth is that Hebron, Shechem, and Jericho all came under Israel's control as a result of the victory in 1967. All of these areas were under Jordanian control from 1948, and in different stages of implementing the Oslo Agreement, these cities were given over to the Palestinian Authority. So it's all connected. Was the tomb of Joseph recently destroyed? The tomb of Joseph, which is in the city of Shechem, which is under the Palestinian Authority and off limits for Jewish people at most times, has been assaulted by the Arab bandits time and time again. And recently again, they've caused major damage to the biblical, historical burial place of Joseph from the Bible. Yes, that is the truth. And after they destroyed it, we came in and we repaired and fixed and so forth. And then they came and caused damage again. It's a very sad reality. Number 3, the third question is, if most of the tombs are in the so-called Palestinian areas, is that proof enough for the world to realize that the land belongs to Jews and Israelis? Rivkah, if I understand what you're asking, you're saying if these biblical Israelite tombs are here, isn't that enough for the world to understand that this land should be under the control of the Jewish state of Israel? That makes sense to me. I guess it makes sense to you. Unfortunately, the world is not really interested in what the Bible says. They're not interested in the historical fact that this land is the historical, biblical heartland of the Israel in the Bible, and of course it should be under Israel's control today. Again, this was David Haivri, and this is a short update response to a comment that I got from Rivkah on Root Source, and I'll be glad to hear from other students. Please send me your comments. Good being with you. Shalom.